Chapter 5. Piece of Cake. DJ glanced in the rearview mirror. All he could see was the long trail of dust kicking up as he rapidly snaked his way down the canyon road. He was pretty sure that they saw him turn off the highway, but he was pulling further ahead due to the combination of a better equipped vehicle for this terrain and his familiarity with his own piece of property. When he turned his attention back to the dirt and gravel road in front of him, he realized he had made a tragic mistake. He suddenly remembered the washed-out section too late to do anything about it. He had barely even removed his foot from the gas when he hit it hard. The Jeep was catapulted into the air, off the road and into the trees that lined the creek. As he flew through the air, he considered just how bad this was going to hurt. In his haste to leave the three behind him, he had not bothered to even put on his seat belt. He was launched from the seat to smash his head into the roof, sending his hat flying. Pine boughs broke and splintered as the Jeep hurtled into them, and the Wrangler began to twist in flight. With DJ bouncing around the inside like a steel bearing in a pinball machine, the Wrangler smashed hard into a mature aspen on the left-hand side and came violently to a halt. DJ, in turn, came to a halt just as violently inside the vehicle. The sudden stabbing pain in his shoulder informed him that it had been dislocated. He gingerly placed his right hand on the top of his head to see how bad his head wound was. There was no blood, but it was already beginning to swell, and his neck was sore from the impact. Additionally, his left shoulder was screaming at him. He was in trouble. His pursuers would be here any second. The pain would have to be ignored if he had any hope of living through this. Getting out using the driver's side door was out of the question. It was mangled and pinned against the aspen. With no other choice, he began to haul himself over the console toward the passenger side, yelling aloud at the pain and his own stupidity as he went. He couldn't let himself be taken out like this, he silently vowed. He would not be put down like a wounded animal. He was still alive. The pain reminded him of that fact. And while he was still breathing, there was a chance of coming out of this. He summoned the will to move even faster. The passenger door stuck for a second, then broke free. It caused him to tumble out onto the rocky ground. His shoulder sent a fresh stab of pain, and for a second, he thought he might lose consciousness. From back on the road, he could make out the sound of wheels on gravel. He had to move. He had to disappear into the trees on the other side of the creek. He pulled himself up slowly, using the branch of a pine tree. The truck was almost here. He only had seconds. As fast as he could, which could only be considered slow at best, he let go of the pine and started across the creek. Water washed over his hiking boots, and the sharp cold was momentarily a brief distraction from his injuries. He sloshed his way across, doing his best to make sure of his footing. If he went down now, it was uncertain if he could make it back up. Behind him, he heard the truck lock up its brakes and slide on the gravel, making a grating sound that penetrated the still air. He heard doors open as they realized that he had wrecked the Jeep. "You swing out that way," he heard Skinhead say. "We'll hit him from both sides." Then, gratefully, he was into the heavy tree line on the other side. The darkness of the canopy of pine closed around him, concealing him from view. He picked his way slowly through to the far side, trying to both make sure of his footing and attempting to be as quiet as possible. During this time of the year, the creek ran low, so any noise he would make would not be covered by the sound of running water. Fed by a natural spring from up the canyon, the creek always had water, but it varied in the amount depending on the time of year. In both the middle of winter and summer, it produced about as much water as a couple of garden hoses. During the spring, canyon, and fall, it spit out water like a fire hydrant. During those times of year, the canyon was filled with the sounds of babbling water cascading over rocks. But now, it only made a trickling sound here and there as you got close. He would have to be as stealthy as possible, or he would give away his position. He could now hear agitated discussion as the three discovered he was missing. Then, "You're dead! You hear me? You're dead!" He thought it was Soul Patch that shouted his promise. He emerged from the copse of trees against the far south side cliff wall. His immediate plan was to follow the cliff west towards the end of the canyon and his waiting cabin. In his cabin were the tools he expected to use to exact his vengeance on the three, but first he needed to take care of his shoulder. It was already numb, and his fingers were tingling. As a medic serving Marines in wartime, while ever briefly, he was exposed to a number of real-world medical situations. A dislocated shoulder was something he had dealt with. He had just never had to deal with it on himself. It was really rather easy, however, and was nothing like depicted on the movies or on TV. In order to fix his shoulder himself, he needed not slam his shoulder into a tree or any other Hollywood tricks. He only needed gravity. He stood upright and squared his feet. Next, he leaned over on his left hip, letting his left arm hang straight down towards the ground. It smarted as he slowly let his arm extend downward, but he gritted his teeth and continued. In a slow motion, he rotated at his hip until he was leaning both backwards but still a bit on his left-hand side, all the while allowing gravity to pull his wounded arm downwards. Then, very slowly, he began to stand back upright. He could feel the tension and pressure building in his shoulder and his chest. More tension. More. Then, just like that, he felt the sudden sharp pain of his shoulder popping back in place. He instantly started to feel better, and sensation began to rapidly return to his fingers. He gingerly rotated his arm, testing it. It felt pretty good, all things considered. It would still be sore for a while, but it would no longer be any real hindrance. Next, he rubbed his neck with his right hand. That one hurt pretty good, and he would have to keep it moving or it would stiffen up. He listened carefully for sounds of his pursuers. He thought he could make out some conversation happening, but was unsure of what was being said. Then he heard movement through the trees on the far side. A second later, and the truck started up and began to move down the gravel road towards his cabin. Did all of them head that way? Were they all loaded up in the truck? If so, that ruined his chances at vengeance. If they made it to the cabin, there was no way he could sneak past all three, locate his guns, and go to war with them. If they were still there, that meant heading back towards the main road, trying to flag down help from a passing car would be his only workable choice. Which way should he go? It was quiet. The sound of the truck faded away and he could hear nothing. No wind, no birds. It was just still and hot. The sun was just starting to arch downward to the west, and it would still be light for quite a while. He stood as still as he could, just within the shade of the ponderosa pine, and listened for some sign of movement. Something that would tell him that they had all left. Something to let him know if there was anyone left behind, waiting to ambush him. From the east, off in the distance, he heard the sound of a vehicle pass, its wheels humming on the asphalt surface of Highway 160. It droned on by. Then the quiet returned with its passing. Nothing. Nothing at all. Then, splashing water. At least one person was coming across the creek towards him. He turned and began to move as stealthily as he could to the west and up the canyon. He moved quickly, but with care to choose where he stepped. A rock kicked aside or a branch breaking would allow his pursuer to zero in on his location. He wound his way along the cliff face as fast as possible, snaking through the pine trees until he came to the edge of a small clearing. To his left, the high walls of the canyon. To his right, it was clear all the way to the stream and the gravel road beyond. He searched for some signs of movement, looking for an ambush. He would be completely exposed here as he crossed the clearing. From within, he could hear his own heart pounding in his ears from both exertion and weird excitement. From behind him, he could hear his pursuer closing through the trees. Whoever it was less concerned with making noise than he. He had to stay ahead of them. He had to risk crossing the clearing. He had to do it now. He took a deep breath and then bolted for the other side as fast as he could. His legs pumped hard, propelling him across the field, and he waited for gunshots to ring out from the underbrush in front of him. Here, there was no threat of making excessive noise. Here it was only tall field grass and open spaces. A perfect place for an ambush. No one opened fire on him, and he tore into the waiting tree line. Skidding to a halt, he looked behind him through the undergrowth to search out his pursuer. But he caught movement from the direction of the road first. There, walking on the edge of the gravel, elevated above the creek on the far side, was Soul Patch. He was carrying his gun in one hand. He paused for a moment, looking down at something in his other hand, and brought it up to his ear. A cell phone. At that moment, on the opposite side of the clearing, directly across from him, Skinhead emerged and paused to search the field and the trees. For a second, he seemed to look right at DJ, and he wondered if he had been spotted. Skinhead's phone rang. A funky ringtone carried across the area, some popular song on the radio, and he clawed at his jacket in an effort to find it and shut it up. He held it to his ear, and DJ could vaguely hear conversation from across the clearing. They were not exactly trying to be stealthy, and why would they? They had nothing to fear from DJ. He was unarmed, after all. Skinhead turned his attention to the road on his far right, looking for his accomplice. They spotted each other about 100 yards apart. They talked a moment more, and then both returned their phones to pockets. They then started forward together in unison, Soul Patch following the road and Skinhead across the clearing. He was being herded, he realized, like jackals herded. Blondie, having driven ahead in the truck, was somewhere ahead of him, just waiting to gun him down. But where was he? DJ turned and restarted his trek towards his cabin, keeping the cliff wall as close as possible on his left. He considered his options as he moved. There was one more clearing just like the one he had crossed, not too far ahead. That would certainly be a good place to wait for him. Beyond that, the canyon narrowed even more. It was densely covered in trees, but would make for a great choke point. After that, the canyon opened wide to be maybe 400 yards across. On the north side of that expanse, the road ended at his cabin. His home was perched 30 feet higher than the rest on a small hill and overlooking it all. Across the creek and down the hill from the house was more field dotted with small groups of aspen. It made for a great view across the valley all the way to the opposite cliff face. It also would make for a great place to shoot him from. If they managed one of his scoped rifles in his unlocked cabin, he would not stand a chance of crossing the valley floor to his home. Beyond the cabin, it narrowed once again. At that point, it was only wide enough for the ATV trail that made its way up from his cabin and the creek itself. It was a narrow gorge of only 30 to 40 feet in length. After that, you entered into what DJ called Paradise. Paradise was at the very end of the canyon. It opened up to be an almost perfectly shaped circular glen, surrounded by the steep rock walls. From the entrance where the creek fed through to the far side, it was a little over 500 yards across. On the western end, a natural spring produced a steady stream of water right out of the rock face about 50 feet off the valley floor. It dumped its contents first into a small pond, about an acre in size, before spilling its way down the canyon and splitting the glen in two. On the north side was the abandoned mine. It had been named the Midget Mine for its original owners, a small troop of midgets that were rumored to have once served a traveling circus before setting off on their own to strike it rich in the mid-1800s. It had never really produced much, and the owners simply disappeared over time. The mine itself was not really much more than a small cave, tunneling into the rock no more than 100 feet. DJ had turned the entrance of the mine into a sort of shooting grotto. He had a small bench made for rifle shooting just inside the shade of the entrance. From there, shielded from the elements, he could see all the way across to the opposite side of the canyon. Additionally, DJ became infatuated by a type of shooting competition called three-gun, so named because it involved the use of 3 types of weapons: a handgun, a modern-day sporting rifle, typically an AR-15 style weapon, and a shotgun. Picture an obstacle course with firearms and a stopwatch, and you would quickly begin to understand the concept of three-gun. DJ loved the sport and set up his own course that weaved its way through the end of the canyon. From the higher vantage point of the cave entrance, you could make out maybe 50 steel targets that comprised his rifle range and three-gun course. Not only was the end of his canyon a visual paradise decorated with small groups of trees, the waterfall, the pond, and a stream, but it was a shooter's paradise as well. Paradise was not his destination, however. The guns hidden in his cabin were. But he was going to present a serious challenge in reaching them. He would have to make it through the canyon equipped with plenty of ambush points, past 3 killers determined to murder him, sneak into his own cabin past all of them just to get to those guns. Piece of cake, he sarcastically said out loud.